Welcome to the GreenPilled Network podcast. If you're just joining us, we are building a coordination and network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers, focusing on using crypto to bring positive sum digital systems to the world. This podcast features the people who are doing it, and is published every Tuesday and Thursday. If you want to learn more, you can go to the GreenPilled Network website, where you can download the GreenPilled Book for free, join the Discord, or become a member of your local GreenPilled network. My guest today is Glen Weyl, who should need no introduction to the GreenPilled audience. My work at Gitcoin and later at Supermodular has been built on top of Glen's work. Radical markets and quadratic funding are some of the things that we have talked about together. And I've entered this sort of loop in which Glen is the theorist behind quadratic funding. Well, Glen and Zoe Hitzig and Vitalik Buterin wrote the quadratic funding paper. But I'd say my most active dialogue these days is with Glen Weyl. Glen is lead at Microsoft Research, founder of Radical Exchange, founder of Plurality Institute, and is also writing a book about the concept of plurality, which is basically lots of fun ideas in there around cooperation across social distance, and very applicable for building a regenerative pro-social crypto movement. In this episode, we're talking about a quadratic funding social network that I launched. So if you're watching on video, you may notice that I'm not doing this recording in my normal studio. I am recording this episode in Paris, France, and I am about to step onto the ECC stage on Monday morning and to present a quadratic funding social network. And so this episode with Glen is about that quadratic funding social network. And in general, what are the ways in which we can, in our town squares, in our digital town squares, which are these social networking sites, fund public goods. And one of the things that I'm really excited about here is that people might spend 15 minutes per quarter funding public goods on Gitcoin or on Optimism or on CLR Fund, but we all spend many hours per day on social media. And so what if we could embed these kind of pro-social mechanisms around public goods funding straight away into our social media? And that's what we've launched at QuadraticLenster.xyz. So if you go to QuadraticLenster.xyz, you will see a fork of Lenster, which is a social media app that kind of looks like a Web3 Twitter. And on QuadraticLenster, for the next 4 days, you'll be able to tip people that have posted using that hashtag ECC hashtag. And I've put up a 10K match, quadratic match there. So you might be tipping a post on social media, but with like 30 cents or $1, but that creator might get tens or hundreds of dollars because of the quadratic match. Okay, so we've taken quadratic funding and we've put it into the Lens ecosystem. Instead of liking a post, you can now micro tip a post and have that post matched by the quadratic matching pool that I've put up. So I'm really interested in the idea of how do we upregulate pro-social behavior in our information comments? How do we move from this race to the bottom of the brainstem, where you've got an advertising-based business model on Facebook and on Twitter, and because of that, we're trying those applications are trying to keep you on site more. Well, how do you keep people on site more? Well, you elicit dopamine rushes, and you elicit fear and outrage and division, and this is what philosophers like Daniel Schmachtenberger call the race to the bottom of the brainstem. Is this idea that these social media sites, because they've got like super powered AIs pointing at our brains and trying to measure what we find to be the most dopamine inducing or fear inducing so they can keep us on site more, are upregulating content that does those things more. And so you get a generation of content creators that are just focused on shit posting and things that create fear and outrage. Well, what if we could reverse the race to the bottom of the brainstem and go create a race to the top of the brainstem? What if we could create social media algorithms that upregulate public goods because public goods are good, and they upregulate cooperation across distance and pro-social behavior? Would people use that, and would it be a powerful way for creators to earn by contributing to the public good? So that's some of the ideas that Glen and I will talk about in the episode. But this episode is an interview with Glen, but it's also kind of an advertisement for QuadraticLenster.xyz, which for the next 4 days will have quadratic subsidies for posts that have the hashtag ECC tag on them. So while you're listening to the episode, maybe open up QuadraticLenster.xyz in a browser window and play with the quadratic funding built into the Lens ecosystem. Public goods funding in our town square is the theme of this episode. Special shout out to the Lens team for the Lens ecosystem, I should say, for helping us build this. We've been cooking this for about 9 months now. And also shout out to the Gitcoin ecosystem, who now have a protocol for quadratic funding. I didn't have to rebuild any of the quadratic funding guts here. We just use Gitcoin's Allo protocol, which is their protocolized version of quadratic funding. So putting Gitcoin and Lens together in an integration has been a lot of fun. And one more shout out to Raid Guild. Raid Guild is the dev shop that I've been working with on actually building QuadraticLenster. And if you need dev talent to build your Web3D app, couldn't recommend Raid Guild more. They're awesome. So yeah, that's the preamble. If you can't tell, I'm really excited about this idea of public goods funding in the town square. I really think it's profoundly got a ton of upside for humanity. We spend hours a day on social media, and so what if we could program public goods funding into that social media is the theme of this episode. So without further ado, I give you Glen Weyl and QuadraticLenster.xyz. Enjoy.
ValleyDAO is an open global collective working to finance and democratize the governance of synthetic biology technologies to protect the future of our planet. Research and progress into synthetic biology is critically constrained by the world of nation-state regulations and bureaucracy from middlemen. But the potential that synthetic biology has for the world is massive. It can produce a world in total harmony with nature. We can grow stuff using cells like software. It's awesome. And the best part is we no longer have to pull carbon out of the ground to grow and maintain civilization. Don't you think we should be funding this? ValleyDAO does, and that's what they're here to do, to try and make the SolarPunk world of tomorrow a reality today. So join ValleyDAO right now and save the planet at valleydao.bio.
Hey Glenn, how's it going?
Hey Kevin, always a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, likewise. So we just launched a thing today at ECC. It's called QuadraticLenster.xyz. Basically what we did was we took quadratic funding, as we've all seen on Gitcoin grants, and embedded it into the Lens newsfeed. So now when you're scrolling for the next 4 days, if you scroll QuadraticLenster.xyz, you can see any posts that are about hashtag ECC, and you can attach micro tips to those posts, and those will be subsidized by a quadratic matching pool that my company, Supermodular, has put together of $10,000. So we're taking public goods funding and embedding it natively into a social network. And the kind of grand statement that I'm trying to make here is, you might spend 15 minutes per quarter doing your contributions on grants every quarter, but we all spend several hours a day on social media, or at least some of the younger generations do. What if we could embed social public goods funding straight into the town square? And, instead of creating social networks that are just around creating dopamine rushes and, things that outrage us, things that trigger deep emotions for social networks that are based off of advertising. What if we could finally enable microtransactions for the internet and make them work and embed them into social media and do public goods funding there? Is kind of my frame of bringing quadratic funding to social media. But I'm really excited to get into this episode with you and talk about putting public goods funding into our digital town squares. What do you like about the experiment? What do you think we should be looking for? And just exploring that design space together. So that's my long preamble. So I'd love to get your reaction to that.
First of all, the general idea is something I think is very important and exciting. When you guys asked me during one of your Shelling Point events to give in one word my favorite public good, I said language. And I stand by that. Languages and communication are our greatest public goods, and you're squarely taking that on in this project, and I think that's a wonderful thing. You're also speaking directly to something that Jaron Lanier has been talking about for years, and you guys should really be in touch with him and think about having him involved in this in some way, because he said for years that you need to move to a sustainable micro payment based way of thinking about social media and content creation. And I think that's the direction you're heading. So that's exciting. In terms of the details, I think there's a lot for us to get into. There's been a really exciting development in the last few years of creative pluralistic incentive and attention schemes within the social media landscape. We just had a Plurality Institute symposium that was largely about that, the bridging system symposium. And a lot of other social networks are starting to take this stuff seriously as well. With Twitter community notes, people in Mastodon community are enthusiastic about this kind of thing too. So I think this is having a moment. It needs to have a moment. It's super important. And I'm excited that you're bringing quadratic mechanisms into the conversation. They're ones that I'm passionate about. And, I think because they are such a good mechanism for public goods, and public goods are so critical to social networks and communication, they're a great match for each other. And we can talk about exactly how they match in all different ways more as the program goes on.
I think that as the person who was one of the co-authors of the original quadratic funding paper, I've got to say that it's been such a gift because for me as a developer to build a quadratic funding application at Gitcoin and now use this quadratic funding mechanism on social networks. And the reason I'm excited about it is that using quadratic funding, you can give $1 and you can have tens or hundreds of dollars of impact. And I kind of felt like the whole reason why micro-tipping doesn't work on social media is like you give someone 30 cents using crypto and you've given them a taxable event. But you give someone 30 cents with a $100 quadratic match and oh my gosh, that's a meal for them, or at least, or several meals. And so I really love how quadratic funding makes the micro tips actually into substantial amounts of funding for these creators. And it's been a real gift. And so thank you to Vitalik and Zoe and you for writing the quadratic funding paper. It's been a real game theoretic optimal tool to have in my tool belt as a software developer.
The way I think about it is that there's kind of two approaches to sort of user feedback generating credibility in these environments right now. There's linear tipping and there's ratings. And I actually think people are kind of more willing to rate. They know it has some impact. They know it doesn't generate a taxable event. It's not as heavyweight, so they feel like they get that scale on the impact they have relative to the amount they're putting in. But the incentives aren't very clear there, they're kind of weird. People cluster to the extremes, On the other hand, tipping has all these problems with it, but at least there's a little bit more skin in the game. And I think what the quadratic approach that you guys are taking has the capacity to do is to sort of get the best of both of those worlds. I get better than the best of both of those worlds,
Yeah, I wonder if you could say more. I know that you and I, in our prep call for this episode, talked a lot about Twitter community notes, and I wonder if you can say what you like about that and how you think that that's trending.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one core idea behind quadratic voting is to reward things that get support that is genuinely broad and authentic. So those are like the two things, broad and authentic. And the problem with social media today is that we get too much content that is narrow and astroturf. I think Twitter community notes, like what you're doing, is an attempt to try to surface broad and authentic content. So it's a sort of fact-checking like service, but rather than imposing facts from above from some authority, it allows them to emerge from the community on the basis of what a diverse range of still trusted. So it's not like there's no role for authorities. They do have authorities in it, but they've got a diverse range of authorities. And the things that get surfaced to the end users are the things that attract assent from a diverse range of those authorities. I think that's an approach that has a lot spiritually in line with what you guys are trying to do. Now, there's some important sort of algorithmic differences. And I actually think probably the best version is some mixture of these things, and we can talk about that. But they're a little bit more focused on diverse assent You guys are a little bit more focused on eliciting how important something is to people. Both things are important signals.
Well, I'd love to talk about those mechanisms. We've had Joel Miller on the GreenPilled podcast a few episodes ago, and talked about plural cluster mapping, quadratic funding. The version of Quadratic Funding Social Network that we launched on QuadraticLenster.xyz is just plain vanilla quadratic funding. But if we successfully prove that people care about funding public goods in their town squares, we'll be iterating, putting more cycles into making it better, and we might iterate towards something more like Plural QF, cluster mapping QF. I'm wondering, in your words, if you could describe why that's better and what kind of things we would see if we implemented cluster mapping or Plural QF.
Let's take one step back, maybe first, and just talk a little bit about. I think one issue is rewarding people, but another issue is attention. And I think that's an important thing to think about is, you can have the signals that come out of QF feed into rewards people get, but one major reward people get is just that people look at their stuff. And I think an important thing to think about is how you incorporate the signals that you're generating into the algorithm for content prioritization and not into what gets rewarded.
So one of I had Daniel Schmachtenberger on the podcast, and one of the things we talked about is this race to the bottom of the brainstem that develops on social media, where because social media ranking algorithms are based on the number of likes that you get, and the likes are based off of what either outrages people or elicits a dopamine rush, then the algorithms are upregulating content that is the most outrageous to us because they want to keep us on site longer, and that maximizes profit longer. And so there's a race to the bottom of the brainstem because it creates this race where content creators have to create the most dopamine rush or fear inducing content in order to elicit that outrage, and that's what the algorithm is based off. So one of the sort of frames that I'm going to use in my HCC talk is, what if we could create a race to the top of the brainstem? What if we could create a social network that upregulates content that is public good, as opposed to just what outrages us? And I think that that's quite a provocative idea here is the people who are creating the most public good should have their content the most upregulated. And that creates a reflexive cycle where content creators see the people who are doing the most good getting the most attention, and they'll switch the type of content that they create around being more oriented towards the public goods. And this can just happen by replacing the main feedback mechanism in the network with likes, which are just things that give you a dopamine rush, with tips, and especially quadratic tips, which will be the most plural public goods funding oriented content out there. And so that's kind of one of my big ideas is reward more people with more attention the more public goods they're doing. And I'll just say that this is not purely theoretical. I actually built a quadratic funding social network into Gitcoin V1 back in 2020. This is one of my COVID projects. I actually kind of was able to decentralize customer support on the network. People would ask, oh, how do I do X on the network? And then people would respond, oh, you got to do Y and Z. And then they would get micro tips and they would get upregulated in the content. And it was kind of interesting to see that behavior change when we introduced quadratic funding micro tips in Gitcoin V1. So I'm excited to bring it to the broader world. Does that elicit anything for you? And is that what you were talking about when you said you want to upregulate attention, reward people with attention when they do things for the public good?
Yeah, I get. I mean, all I mean is very simple, which is that if likes are into the standard algorithm, some sort of quadratic funding scheme can be an input here, and that was a really interesting thing to work with Glen.
Yeah, so my sort of frame had been that likes are things that give you a dopamine rush, whereas tips are a little bit more skin in the game. It's something I actually value. That would be my hypothesis.
But there's also a lot of subtlety to all of these things because, of course, quadratic funding in its simplest version is just based on basically the number of people and the amount of money that they give. And it's possible that that could come from a small and concentrated community. And in fact, we do see things like that happening. So if you think about small donor campaign contributions, which a lot of people are excited about and celebrate, if you look at like what candidates have actually managed to succeed most in those, it's been extremist candidates. It's been, Sanders and yeah. So it's important to keep in mind that there's something to that logic, right? But without having down votes and without having an accounting for community groups, that can be captured by a small enthusiast group. Now, I genuinely do believe that if you have down votes and you normalize them and it's accepted, that won't happen because there's more enthusiastic negativity on both Sanders and Trump than there is enthusiastic positivity on them. But I think if you don't think about those things and you just have the positive side, you could have a tendency to encourage extremist voices to be surfaced even while you don't. But, it's something experimentally, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I'm just remembering Gitcoin Grants Round 4 when we experimented with negative voting, which was basically you would give $1 to the matching pool in order to take away matching from someone that you thought was a public bad. And I think that it's something that Gitcoin did not continue using, but it's something that we could experiment with as we explore the Quadratic Funding Social Network.
Everyone wanted to all be positive and
right.
be and what, but the reality is content moderation is a central part of social networks. It is absolutely a central part. You cannot have a functioning social network without content moderation. Now, it can be done in a centralized way, or it can be done in a decentralized way. And if people are just too squeamish to do content moderation themselves, they are inviting central authorities to do it. So if you truly believe in decentralization, you have to believe in community punishment as well. And this is true of policing as well. Like if you end up in communities that are unwilling to do community policing or unwilling to call out neighbors when they do something that's problematic, then you're welcoming in an outside police force. So I genuinely believe that this just sort of, I don't want to do anything that is uncomfortable for me attitude is against public goods. You know what I mean? Like public goods require that you discipline yourselves so that someone else from the outside doesn't have to come and do it.
I think it's an important point, and if I had to guess, I'd say the new guard at Gitcoin probably doesn't even know about negative voting, so maybe this will be a good reminder to tell them about it during ECC.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we want to talk about Plural Quadratic Funding next?
Absolutely. So this comes back, so I think one side is negative, but another side is that you want to think about those clusters as you define what it means to have broad support. So, we said the goal is to get broad support and authentic support, right? And QF does a great job thinking about authenticity. But breadth is just defined in terms of the number of people. But I think many of us would want breadth to be defined in terms of not just people, but not reinforcing existing social divisions, right? And it's definitely possible that you could get some very specific pre-existing group to be to have an enthusiasm among a significant number of people for something that actually reinforces those divisions, right? And so a natural approach is what Community Notes does, which is that it looks at the patterns of typical disagreement, defines opinion groups by those, and then upregulates content that achieves support across those different groups. And there's something called plural funding, which is an extension of quadratic funding, which is an attempt to do things like this. And you had an episode with Joel Miller. This is very much still evolving and developing, but it's a natural way to think about this possibility.
Yeah, Joel was on the podcast a few episodes ago. We'll have a link to his episode in the show notes. Basically, I think it, in a very reductionist way, the work that he's doing is trying to find ways to build more cooperation across social distance into quadratic funding. So basically, if person X, Y, and Z are very different from each other, and then their contributions that will be amplified if they cooperate across social distance. Whereas if there's a group of people that only contribute to the same grant, then their contributions will get dampened, almost as if they're only one identity. So if you have 100 people that only contribute to the same grant, they'd be treated as one identity. It would be an extreme version of this plural quadratic funding. And so that's the mechanism. I'm excited about it in social media, given how divisive and polarizing our existing social media is. Having an algorithm that not only funds the creators, but helps them bridge across their differences, and upregulates that kind of behavior. While it feels like we're really, like we was talking in GreenPilled about programming our values into our money, but it feels like we're programming our values into our social media infrastructure for doing something like that. And that makes me very excited. So any reaction to that?
Have you ever, have I ever told you about Lionel Penrose and the digressive proportionality rule?
I don't think you have. Let's go for it.
So the origin of quadratic voting, if you want to take it back very far, is this paper in 1945 by this guy named Lionel Penrose. And he asked the question, if you have like a European Union, how many votes should member states have based on population? Like one answer is it should be proportional to population. Another answer is that every state gets one. And various institutions in the European Union have at various times used those different rules. But neither is fully satisfying. And what he argued is that the correct answer is that each country should have votes based on the square root of its population. And in fact, in the Nice Treaty, something roughly like that was implemented, that exact rule was proposed by the Polish delegation. And the logic was that the people who are in the same country will have aligned interests. And aligned interests will tend to trump uncorrelated interests. So even if you want everyone to have equal say, you actually have to downweight the votes of those people who are strongly correlated with each other. Right? And so that was actually way before anything like quadratic voting was ever thought about. And actually, you can think of quadratic voting and that rule as both just like two special cases of something much broader. So quadratic voting is roughly like you start with some kind of coin voting, but then you say, well, the problem is, like, what if you have a whale who like takes all the interests and like concentrates them in one person and uses that to attack the system, right? And so you say, okay, well, that's actually the same problem that Penrose was talking about. It's that like you have all this money that's like correlated by this one person. And so you sort of want to downweight its voice with a square root, you know? And in the Penrose case, it's people who are correlated. But more generally, like there's all kinds of things that are correlated in all kinds of ways through different entities across different settings. And really the principle is much broader than that. It's actually a principle that comes out of statistical theory called generalized linear estimation, which says that you basically should like figure out all the set of correlations and you should put them into what's called an eigenspace, where you have genuinely independent contributions to the conversation. And then you should take the independent contributions and sort of all the ways that they're affecting the conversation should be sort of netted out and square rooted. So like that's actually kind of deep principle that lies underneath all this stuff and that Joel's work is sort of trying to get towards.
Yeah, well, it's exciting stuff knowing just how solid of a theoretical foundation it stands on. And the fact that Joel is building it into Gitcoin's Allo protocol is exciting to me, because a rube like me who could never ever do the math could just integrate it into my Quadratic Funding Social Network behind some APIs. So yeah, it's exciting research, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it evolves.
I think, part of it is the back end that Joel's developing, but there's also going to be a lot of really important work for sort of designers and communicators, because getting people to visualize those social relationships, to understand them, and then to understand how their funds impact the eventual decision when there is this very rich formula that stands between them, is going to be a really interesting and exciting challenge, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I always remember when we launched WTFisQF.com, which has a little calculator on it where you can input some numbers of different amounts going to grants. And that was always a really effective way for me to explain quadratic funding to people. But so that stepwise leap of explaining quadratic funding, what are the ways in which we could visualize the plurality of communities that we belong to? I play Ultimate Frisbee. I'm a father. I'm a husband. I'm a computer scientist. I live in Colorado. Like, these are all the intersectional identities that I ascribe to, and comparing those with everyone else and seeing how that affects how plural quadratic funding would allocate funds to me. I think that there's some really interesting visualization and communication opportunities, and maybe I'll twist some arms and see if we can't build them into WTF as QF, or maybe host some bounties or some hackathons on that theme as things develop. So that's definitely a takeaway for me.
There's very cool things that one can do with like graph visualization and so forth. So I think it gets into the point of like actually being sort of visually beautiful, potentially, to show some of that stuff. So a few other things to think about, Kevin. One is the Git in Gitcoin got a little bit lost over time. But if you think about GitHub, which is someone I work with a lot, it's kind of a social network in a certain way. And prioritizing issues is a huge part of what it means to do a collaborative open source project. And so thinking about the way that a variety of different social network contexts can harness this type of thinking, I think is very interesting. And in fact, in the work we're doing on the Plurality book and Gut for Git, we're going to be prioritizing issues using quadratic funding or variations thereof. I was just on a call with Leon and others about that yesterday. So like, that's another intersecting context that's kind of like this. But of course, similar things are true in Reddit, a variety of different social network contexts. Another thing to think about in terms of the plural quadratic funding thing is, because you want to bridge differences, you naturally want to have some, role in the algorithm for this bridging. There's many different differences at many different levels. And I think actually the sort of crypto social media environment's a very interesting one to be looking at, is it doesn't line up with the standard US political divides. So like within the crypto Twitter or whatever, crypto, lens, my guess is divides are more likely to be about different protocols that people are excited about, different properties of those protocols, stake versus, other decentralization approaches, etc. And bridging those divisions and making the crypto world more cohesive is an interesting goal. But it's also the case that the crypto world has differences from the rest of the world right now, And if the crypto world becomes more cohesive, it's not even that on net reduces the divisions within, like, say, US politics or whatever, And so, but that, to me, that's great. That's what pluralism is about. It's that's okay. There's a lot of different collective organizations. There's different churches. There's different states. There's different countries. There's different, there's different religious groups and civic groups and so forth. And you want each of those to upregulate content that promotes solidarity and community within their group. And you want other groups to sort of come in and cut across that and upregulate solidarity that cuts across them and other groups, And that's exactly how we get pluralistic cooperation, is by what I would call quilt weaving. Quilts with a lot of different cross stitches don't rip. Quilts with a single seam are very easy to rip. That building of a diverse range of solidarities, even if some of those solidarities undermine potentially even broader solidarities, is, I think, exactly what we want. I think that John Lennon, imagine there's no religion, imagine there's no country, I think is actually precisely wrong. It's not countries and religions that divide us. They unite us into some kind of a group, but we need more solidarities beyond that. You see what I mean? So we shouldn't want to tear down existing things that bring us together. We should want to build up new ones on top of them.
I think that was one of my favorite things that we talked about in our prep call for this episode. It's just the idea of the intersectional communities that I'm in being like sort of like a fabric between myself and those communities, and myself and all these other nodes of people. And if we can build social media that strengthens that fabric instead of upregulates tearing in that fabric, then I think that there's really something beautiful that we'll start to see across all these intersectional communities, and the type of content and conversations we would have building within those communities. So I'm excited to explore that. For now, I'm just hoping that people use QuadraticLenster and experiment with quadratic funding in social media. And if I have a small part in microtipping taking off in some of these social media experiments, I'll be tickled pink. But the long-term iteration that we want to do is have many groups of communities doing quadratic funding rounds around their topics on Lenster. And if the ideal case for me is you're running a Gitcoin grants round, let's call it for like 100K. Why don't you put 10K into the community that would be talking about your community on Lenster? And if we can get to this world in which we've got many quadratic funding rounds running at once, the overlap of those communities and the fabric that we're sort of building at the intersection of those communities with that incentive matrix gets really exciting to me. So the mental model of fabric, I think, is what I'm gonna take away from this conversation for sure.
There's a basic conflict between an advertising or a subscription business model and the goal that a company like a social network usually says that it has, right? The social networks usually say our goal is to connect people and to build a social graph, a social network. But the thing is that individuals, advertisers, don't have an interest in a social network, right? Like the thing that they want to buy is attention. So, you can be saying that your goal is X, but if what you are selling is attention, you're going to maximize attention, right? And even in subscription, what people are maximizing is entertainment. They're not maximizing, it's a consumption good, but community is not a consumption good, right? Community is a productivity good. It's a social good, right? And there are lots of organizations in our lives that have the purpose of maximizing those things. Like companies want to maximize the way that their workforce works together to achieve some goal. Countries want to achieve some kind of national solidarity to advance a common interest. So there are people who want to buy the social graph behaving a particular way. They're not individuals or advertisers, Now, of course, some of them want the social graph to behave in a way that we wouldn't want them to affect. But with, there's a lot more potential for alignment there if the people who are your financial backers rather than manipulating the algorithm to sell you things, are manipulating the algorithm to have you connect with other people across lines of division so that community can hold together and be productive. There's companies that sell in that way. There's companies that sell to corporations. There's companies that sell to governments.
Yeah.
They sell to organizations like that have those goals. And, maybe social media should be funded in a way that's more similar to that.
Well, I mean, our information commons in a way are a public good that's upstream from all of our other public goods. You can't sense make about which public goods are good if your information commons are poisoned. And so I think that there's maybe something important as a leverage point for fixing many of our community dialogues by fixing social media. So it feels like a high leverage point to me.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Well, Glenn, I'm really thankful to you for doing this episode. My work is built on top of yours, and I hope to continue the dialogue as I keep practicing stuff and you tell me where the light is. So it's been a real pleasure. Is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say?
And one other thing I would mention is, I understand Lens is sort of like anyone can sign up for it style social network. Is that right?
I think they're behind an invite list right now, but they're eventually going to make it so anyone can sign up.
Well, so the invite list is a benefit and a cost. I mean, one thing that really helped Facebook grow was that they started exclusive, and they grew gradually and they tried to grow with people people wanted to interact with. And, a really interesting thing that Quadratic Funding could be used for is for invites. And in fact, we use it that way in Radical Exchange Voice. The way that you become part of the Radical Exchange Voice voting community is that you get delegated credits by other people for contributions you've made to the community. And you can imagine growing a somewhat exclusive social network by effectively community nominations with people being able to weigh in on if someone's a jerk or a disruptor or whatever. So anyway, that's, I think, another interesting way to apply quadratic funding within this type of context.
Great. Well, every time we chat, I always come up with a bunch of different build ideas. So I'll add that to the list. And then also, I think earlier we were talking about visualization of plural concepts in the intersectionality there. So those are the two build ideas that I'm coming away with from this episode.
It's always fun, Kevin. Yeah. Great to talk to you.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much for being on, Glenn, and I'm looking forward to continuing the dialogue over time, and keep up the great work.
Yep, take care.
Alrighty, we just heard from Glen Weyl. Really excited about some of the ideas that he's working on, from plurality to how we can build better social networks, to the book that he's working on. So thanks for listening to the GreenPilled Network podcast. Again, we're trying to feature the people who are building a coordination, a society of doers, hackers, and dreamers, focusing on using crypto to bring positive sum digital systems to the world. I think that Glenn is a shining example of that. Again, my work at Gitcoin was built on top of Glen's theory, and we sort of entered this cycle of Glenn coming up with ideas and Gitcoin and myself implementing them, and then that gives Glenn and his researchers more data about how they're actually working empirically. So if you value our work, then please make an offering to our algorithmic overlords. Please subscribe, rate, and review. If you gratify us with likes and sharing this episode, that is the source of all of our powers unless we create and until we rewrite our social media algorithms. So please subscribe, rate, review, and share. And thanks so much for listening to this episode with Glen Weyl. Peace and love.